In recent weeks, we've walked with Israel through their history. We've, in recent weeks, heard about the Israelites in Egypt, how they came out of Egypt, and they got to the Red Sea, and all of a sudden the Egyptians were coming down upon them. God acted to save them at the Red Sea, opened the sea, they were able to walk on dry land through it, and they were delivered. Then we heard about the Ten Commandments being given over to the Israelites out in the wilderness. And today, we're about 2 generations later, about 40 years later. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. And finally, in this story, they come out of the wilderness and they are delivered to the promised land in Canaan. And the last leader in the wilderness, Joshua, calls the heads of the families together, the leaders of the Israelites. I don't imagine that's a huge group. I imagine it's a group about this size, maybe 100 people. He gathers them together and he sits them down and he says, "Thus says the Lord." And he tells the story of what God has done to bring the Israelites to this point. How he established a relationship with Abraham and his family, and it carried through generations. They went into Egypt. He went out and got them in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness. He saved them again and again from hunger, from flood, from the army of the Egyptians. And now he has given them over this promised land, the land that they did not earn, but has been given to them because of his great love for them. And Joshua concludes, he says, "So, will you serve the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?" You know, for the Israelites by this time, they had been through so many different lands. And each of those lands had a different deity to whom they prayed. And the Israelites had adopted more than a few of those. We hear a lot of echoes of that experience again and again in the Old Testament with the stories of Baal and the golden calf. And over we hear of different deities. Joshua says, today, you need to decide. Are you going to follow, are you going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or are you going to follow one of these others? You decide. Decide today. But for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. The leaders of Israel respond. Far be it from us to turn our back on the God that has been so good to us. We will follow him as well. Now, as an old pastor who taught confirmation for about 40 years, I looked at that and I go, that's confirmation for the people of Israel. They're asked, this relation that was established many years ago, are you going to stay with that relationship or are you going to turn your back upon it? And they are asked to affirm that covenant that was established so many years before. Back when I was teaching confirmation to teenagers every year, we always had a 3-year program. You guys who are getting away with 2 years, you're lucky. We had 3 years. We had Bible study 1 year, small catechism the other second year, and then I would teach the 3rd year. And that year was about life, the church, and faith. Or, as I thought about it, in light of all of what God has done for you. He's made you his own in baptism. He has gifted you with this relationship. In light of what God has done for you, how are you going to respond? Will you serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or will you serve another God? And typically, people, when the kids would ask at some point, well, what are you talking about? Other gods, What other gods are there? Technology. Do you have the newest, best phone? That's important, especially with teenagers, right? Well, I'm feeling a little bit behind the curve these days because my iPhone is now old. And there's a new one out that I probably really need because it's a little bigger and a little faster. I'm wondering, will pockets get bigger to accommodate the new phones? Pretty soon our pockets are going to have to be this wide, I think. Right? The technology has become terribly important. It's a status symbol, isn't it? And the kids are really into that. There are a lot of other religions as our deities as well. The cult of me. You know, Luther called it the old Adam. You know, it's that little voice in your head that says, you know, I just want to do what I want to do when I want to do it, and the heck with everybody else. You ever hear that little voice in your head? When the alarm goes off at 5:30 in the morning on Sunday mornings, I always hear it these days. There's a little voice that says, you're kind of old to get up and do this now. You could just turn over and get another half hour sleep. The old Adam. They call it beauty, popularity. Even the Bible is idolized in our culture these days, you know. Those who take the Bible literally and only what the King James Version doesn't right, they say, it begins to idolize the book rather than to worship God. There's a lot of different deities in our culture these days. So then they say, well, Pastor, then how do you know? How do you know which one? How do you know you're doing the right way? How do you know? And I say, that's why we're here. You get to decide for yourself which is the right way for you. But if you'll give me a moment, I'd like to tell you my story. Now, through many of those years, I was surrounded by kids who were teenagers, but I had baptized. You know, they'd never known another pastor. So when I said, I'd like to tell you my story, most of them were kind of interested. And so then I told them about how the knee warners got to this point. The knee warners were serfs back in northern Germany for a couple hundred years, I think. They were serfs. That meant they basically were slaves. They could not leave the land. They served the feudal lord. And whatever he wanted, they did. They had virtually no law. And they were serfs right up until the point when Napoleon came through, and he ended feudalism. And the serfs were set free. But just like the slaves in the South, when they were freed, they had no way of making money. So they became sharecroppers for the same guy. They couldn't get off the land. It's the same thing with the knee warners in Europe. They also said that their young men, every morning came out, the young men were inscribed into the services, and typically they went off and died. So their best young men, their strongest, were often slaughtered. They could not get out from under. The first knee warner that came to this country had those experiences. His name was John Henry. He went off to war and he survived. It was unusual for a young man to survive war back in those times because they were put to the front and they just slaughtered those guys. He came home, and he came home with a little bit of money in his pocket. Never had experienced it before. And he took his very young bride and their months-old baby girl, and he took the money that he had and he bought a ticket to this new world that he had heard about, America. Didn't know much about it. But he had heard from various people over there that there were jobs there, that they were paid. And he got on that ship. They went down to the bowels of that ship, the bottom. 3 weeks, they journeyed to America. They landed in Baltimore in 1879. We have the possessions that they had back then. These 2 little wooden shoes. He carved them on the way to give to his infant daughter, Mary, my great aunt. 1879. They got to Baltimore. They took a train to Cincinnati. And then, so far as we can tell, they walked to Richmond, Indiana, about 70 miles, about as far as from here to Philadelphia, because they were out of money. They walked, and they got to Richmond, and they found that the uncle still survived, and he helped them find their way. And Richmond, Indiana, at that point was a German enclave. There were a couple of companies that hired the German woodworkers. That's what John Henry did. And he made a life. It was, by our standards, very humble, but it was a beginning. In the next generation, my grandfather, William, became a postman and then a postmaster in Richmond. In the generation following that, my father, as he was finishing high school, was prepared to begin work as a laborer. That had been the expectation all along. And then World War II came along. He expected to get drafted. And but one day, before he graduated high school, the Navy came in and gave all the boys a test. And thank God Dad went to the school that day. And he was paying attention because he scored the highest on the test. And they said, we want you to prepare to become an officer. And so he moved in that moment from planning to be a laborer in some small town thing there. And he went off and got a degree from Northwestern and became an engineer. And because of that moment in our history, then we had the opportunities to go to school. And all of my brothers and sisters have had that opportunity and have done well with it. See, my family sees God active throughout all of this. That God brought us to this new land where we didn't know He didn't know the language, but we learned. He brought us to a new land we didn't know. My forefathers didn't know where Richmond, Indiana was. They had a slip of paper that said Richmond, Indiana. They would show it to people. This is where we want to go. And they put them on the right path. God was active. God cared for us. God took us from nothing and gave us a life in this new land. I shared that story with the kids and I said, so for me and for my family, we serve the Lord. You have to decide that. Are you going to serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Are you going to receive the grace that Jesus has bestowed upon you? Or will you turn and go another way and follow one of these other gods that I've described? There are many of them out there. See, God's grace in baptism, God poured His love upon us and made us part of the family of God. Did that not because we deserve it, but in spite of the fact that we do not deserve it. He did that for each of us before we could do anything. He said, I love you. And throughout the rest of our lives, our God has lives continue to reach out, to beckon, to bring us back. You know, there's a video on the internet these days, on Facebook. I'm always improving my mind. I check out Facebook from time to time. And there was one this last week or so that had a mother cat and kittens, right? And the mother cat had kittens apparently in a backyard up in a little shelter at the top of a slide. You seen this thing? And she had the kittens there. Because we know that because we see one of the kittens coming down the slide. And she comes after it, picks it up on the scruff of the neck, and carries it up the slide, put it back into the shelter. Meantime, another one's going down the slide. And she goes back, brings it back. And about that time, there's another one coming down the slide. See? You know, there are times when I think, like that first hymn we said today, why should we worry when you've created all things? Why should we worry when you put the stars in the heavens? God is so powerful, so great. But there are other times when I see him like that mother cat coming after us, picking us up, and bringing us back. Again and again, he does it because of his love for us. See, it seems to me that's the reason that I've been in the church all these years. That's the reason we come to church, because, you know, our families, we're not Native Americans. Our families all have stories similar to the one I told you, right? They took a terrible chance, and they took a terrible journey to come to this country. Many of them with nothing. God stayed with them, and they built a life. We come here this day to hear the stories and to be blessed by God's grace again and again. God's grace creates freedom for us, gives us the privilege of choosing. God calls us, choose me, follow me, be with me, for I always have been with you. Now we come to the table of grace this day. We know Jesus awaits us, beckoning us to come closer. Help us to know the love of God. Come to me, child, he says, for I love you more than life itself. I know of your faults and failings, and I forgive. I pick you up from death into a new life, a new beginning, a new opportunity. I see that grace right there, that grace of forgiveness, gives us the freedom of a new beginning, a new opportunity to walk with Jesus and to do it better this time around. Our Christ promises to be with us always.